present the Soviet newsreel story of the Prime Minister's 4-day visit to Moscow. On the afternoon of the day of his arrival at an airport of the Russian capital, Soviet, British, and American representatives, headed by Mr Molotov, came forward as the giant Liberator Commando taxied to rest after its long journey from Cairo. At the invitation of Mr Stalin, Mr Churchill had come at the head of an Anglo-American delegation for the war's most vital series of conferences. As the Premier set foot on Russian soil for the first time, he was met by Mr Molotov, who, as a signatory to the Anglo-Soviet Treaty in London recently, became one of the principal architects in the Allied task of building for victory. Mr Averell Harriman came as the representative of President Roosevelt. Sir Alexander Cadougan was among the, in all, 20 delegates who had come to make possibly the most momentous decisions of the war. The American crew of the aircraft were naturally proud of the part they had taken in this three-power meeting. Tributes were then played by a military band. The first statement Mr Churchill made came in the form of a broadcast to the Soviet peoples. This was later shown on Russian screens with a superimposed translation.
And we are determined that we will continue hand in hand. Whatever our sufferings, whatever our toils, we will continue hand in hand like comrades and brothers until every vestige of the Nazi regime has been beaten into the ground, until the memory only of it remains as an example and a warning for future times.
Mr Harriman then came to the microphone.
The President of the United States stands back of everything that Mr Churchill has come to do here.
The official reception over, the delegates entered a fleet of waiting cars to be driven straight to the Kremlin. As he entered, the Prime Minister gave his famous V sign for the cameramen's benefit. Along spacious Gorky Street, the Regent Street of Moscow, sped the limousines. The few people about were unaware of the identity of the occupants. An hour and a half after the Liberator had landed, Mr Churchill with Mr Harriman were starting their talks with Premier Stalin. Although the British and Soviet leaders have corresponded freely during the past 15 months, this is the first time they had met. This initial conference lasted nearly 4 hours, business being conducted through interpreters. Nevertheless, the discussions were carried on in an atmosphere of cordiality and complete sincerity. Among attributes they have in common are courage, determination, and ample qualities of leadership. It will have been noticed that Mr Stalin was wearing his customary semi-uniform of light brown, while Mr Churchill had donned the siren suit so often seen during his visit to America. The Stalin pipe and the Churchill cigar had not yet been lit, but plenty of tobacco was burnt during the many hours the Allied leaders were together, working in close and friendly collaboration. Here is the Russia for which the Allied leaders plan urgent relief, a land of embattled millions. From Leningrad to Stalingrad, well over 1,000 miles of war-shattered country. A blood-soaked battle line which for many agonizing months has been bitterly contested. Men of the Red Armies, from the fighting regiments in the Valdai Hills to the Cossack horsemen of the Don, resisting and counterattacking on the soil of their native land. And back of the fluid front line lies the great industrial belt of the Soviet Union. War factories which in many cases have had to be made as nearly mobile as the armies they serve. The heavily pressed tank factories are working the clock round, while Britain multiplies their output with the help sent over the Arctic sea routes. Within the sound of gunfire, in cities suffering the horrors of siege, work goes on, ready at a moment's notice to evacuate to prepared buildings further back, or spur on production as the invading Nazis are driven from their nearby positions. The supply of arms must never let up. Equally important is the constant training of reinforcements. Reserves for Marshal Timoshenko perfect themselves in the use of a new and deadly anti-tank rifle, a long-muzzled weapon which is causing heavy losses to von Bock's tank division. Stalin's war production planning is something to admire. His factories maintain their output in spite of the vagaries of war. The wheels of industry must never stop. Russian resistance depends upon them. The mission to Moscow drew to a close as dawn broke over the Moscow aerodrome. By the growing light of another day, the Prime Minister and his party prepared to journey back to Cairo and then on to Britain. 4 days in Moscow had done much to forward the new help, which Mr. Churchill said would possibly take the form of military operations to divert German strength from Russia. Help which may eclipse the enormous flow of weapons which this country has sent and is sending to ease the Russians' heavy task. Approaching history will reveal the full scope of the plans that were settled in Moscow. But we pick out the remark of the TUC president as indicative of the support Mr. Churchill has from political supporters and opponents alike. He expressed the gratitude of the British working people for the magnificent example of grim resolution and unflinching devotion to duty of our Prime Minister. Today we see the dawn of greater things by the combined strength of the USSR, the USA, and us.